married to the victim in this case, Dale Harrell. And at that point, they'd been married for about 10 years. Another thing she failed to mention to Mr. Flores is that they were living together with their children as a family. So as time passed, and actually within the first 30 days of meeting, the defendant asked for money. She told Mr. Flores a story about how she needed money to get her brakes fixed. And so he obliged and gave her that money. Over the course of the next few months, he continued to lend her more and more money because she asked for more and more money. And by October of 2007, that sum had grown to a pretty high number. Because of the number, Mr. Flores asked her to sign a promissory note. And on October 2nd, 2007, the defendant did. She signed her first promissory note for $62,500 plus interest. This is the money that she had borrowed from Mr. Flores. Now, Mr. Flores, being a businessman, he was keeping track of all the money that he had been paying the defendant. The defendant told Mr. Flores, "Don't worry, I'm going to be able to pay you this money back." In fact, she told the story about this inheritance that she was to receive. She said that she would be inheriting millions of dollars. That money was to come from an insurance settlement and a trust that her first stepfather had set up for her. She told Mr. Flores that at that point she didn't have the money because it was tied up in some litigation and the estate hadn't been settled yet. But she assured him that she would pay that money back. And on that promissory note, she agreed to pay that money back by December 31st of 2008, or whenever the estate was settled, whichever came first. But time passed on, and the defendant continued to ask Mr. Flores for more and more money. Now, at some point, as you can see, the number grew pretty quickly. Mr. Flores had some questions. He wanted to know some more information about that insurance settlement. He wanted to know more information about that estate and the litigation that was going on. And so he began asking the defendant some questions. He wanted to see the paperwork. After all, she said she had an attorney and it was in litigation. So he wanted to see the paperwork. But whenever he asked to see that paperwork, instead he would get bills or collection notices and a request for more money. So finally, Mr. Flores, about a year later, decided to make a phone call. He was going to call the defendant's attorney and find out what was going on with the estate. I mean, this was a single mother of 3, he thought, and he wanted her to have access to this money. And so in December of 2008, he made a phone call. He made a phone call to that attorney. But when he called that firm, the attorney said that he didn't know about the defendant's case. He didn't know about that trust or that inheritance that she was supposed to receive. And so Mr. Flores grew a little skeptical. He confronted the defendant about this, and she made up an excuse, as she always did whenever he asked her about it. She would come up with an excuse as to why she couldn't show him the divorce decree, why she couldn't show him the paperwork. But this time she gave him the story that the attorney was actually working not with the firm, but through the side, and that's how the money was going to be handled. When Mr. Flores pressed her further, she finally admitted, okay, you know what, that wasn't the truth. In fact, she told him her stepfather wasn't even dead. He was still alive, but she had agreed not to tell people that he was still alive. But she told Mr. Flores not to worry. That money would still come because she had another insurance settlement that was coming due, and she'd be able to prepay him from that money. Well, then in December 2008, things had become tense. Like I said, that sum was growing larger and larger. And Mr. Flores wanted some assurance that he was going to get his money back. So again, he began questioning the defendant about how she was going to do this. Because by that time, the defendant had borrowed over $250,000 from Mr. Flores. So the defendant became pretty insistent on a few things during December of 2008. when Mr. Flores thought it a little odd, but thought the defendant was finally becoming a little more financially responsible and just dismissed it. But as the month progressed, Mr. Flores again began confronting the defendant about some of the stories she had been giving him, some of the inconsistencies he had found in her stories. And finally, she was confronted with the fact that he had given her $8,000 that month, $8,000 in cash. But she was asking Mr. Flores for additional money, and he wanted to know why. Where had that $8,000 she had given him, he had given her earlier in the month, where had it gone? What had it been spent on? And when he pushed and pushed and pushed, the defendant finally gave him a story. She told him that she had had a secret plan, and she used that money to finance that plan. She told Mr. Flores that she intended to kill her husband, and that she had used the money to put a hit out on her husband. The defendant told Mr. Flores that she had contacted an old friend of hers, a guy by the name of Travis Tatro. She contacted Mr. Tatro and asked that he kill her husband. The defendant had come up with a plan that for Dale's birthday, they would go to the casino. Of course, under the ruse that it was a birthday celebration. While out at the casino, the defendant would have already left money stashed in her car. Once her and Dale ran out of money, her plan was to send Dale out to the car to retrieve some of that money. At that point, Travis Tatro would go to the parking lot and kill Dale. Now, it seems as though the defendant recognized some of the fallacies in this plan, and so she had a backup. She told Mr. Flores that if that didn't happen, for whatever reason, she had a backup plan. Her backup plan was to get Dale drunk. They would then spend the night there at the hotel at the casino. She said that what she planned on doing is waiting until Dale fell asleep. And once he fell asleep, she would kill him. And when questioned about it, she would say either that she was being abused by Dale, or he was attempting to force himself on her sexually. So there was plan one, but should that fail, there was plan two. Mr. Flores didn't really know what to make of this information, and he didn't seem to really want to believe that the defendant would do this. So the next day, he received a call from the defendant, the day after Dale's birthday, and he found out that the hit had not gone off. The defendant said for whatever reason, it hadn't happened. And she told Mr. Flores that they were then going to spend another night at the casino so that Mr. Tatro would have some more opportunities to actually get the job done. Well, as it turned out, that hit never took place. But Mr. Flores started thinking about things. By this point, he'd grown a little skeptical, we'll call it. And he started to worry. By this point, he had lent the defendant over $200,000. And he began to think maybe he was the target of that hit. He started thinking maybe he was the one that the defendant wanted dead. After all, when Mr. Flores died, her debt died with him. So he grew a little weary. But somehow, some way, over the course of the next week or so, the defendant found a way to appease him, to ease his mind, and to distract him from those thoughts. So Mr. Flores no longer was as concerned about this, especially because the holidays were coming up. So Christmas holiday came and went, and then December 31st, 2008 hit. Now this is the date that the original promissory note was due, but no payment was made that day. Instead, the defendant, Mr. Flores, renegotiated the loan, because by this point, she owed him $294,000 plus interest. So they renegotiated the loan, and a second promissory note was created. She signed it again for $294,000 plus interest. But this promissory note was to be paid January 8th, 2009, things changed a bit. Because on January 8th of 2009, the defendant contacted Ellen Flores and said that Dale had been killed. She called him and gave him great detail about how Dale was killed that day. She said that her and Dale had had an argument, a confrontation, we'll call it. She said Dale became enraged and that he threw her to the ground and was kicking her and striking her. She said that at that moment her roommate, Stanley Cook, who you'll hear some more about in this case, came in and saw this attack taking place. She said that Stanley ran out to the garage. He got a tire on her. He came back into the house and hit Dale once in the head with that tire iron. She said emergency services were called, and Dale was taken to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead 45 minutes later. She also told Mr. Flores that Stanley Cook had talked to police, and that they had decided to release him because they thought it was self-defense. So that all happened on January 8th of 2009. Now, Mr. Flores offered to come over to the house. Ooh, but the defendant was very insistent. She said, no, no, no. Under no circumstances do I want you to come over. She told him that Dale's family was there, dealing with the aftermath of this horrible incident. And so she begged Mr. Flores to stay away. And so he did, for a few days. But come January 13th of 2009, Mr. Flores was starting to grow even more suspicious. And again, these thoughts started coming back into his mind. And on January 13th, he made a decision. He was going to go to that house, he was going to confront the defendant, and he was going to find out what was going on. But to Mr. Flores' surprise, when he got to that house, only the roommate, Stan Cook, and the kids were there. Mr. Flores inquired as to the whereabouts of the defendant. That was who he was there to see. And he learned that the defendant had gone out for a night. And she had gone out with Dale. Well, obviously, this surprised Mr. Flores. He thought Dale had been dead for a few days. How could she possibly be out with him? And so Mr. Flores became even more suspicious because something wasn't right. And at this point, he could no longer ignore how wrong things were. And so he decided the next morning, the morning of the 14th, to check a bank account. Now, he had a joint bank account with the defendant in an attempt to help get her on the right financial path. On January 14th, in those early morning hours, when he went to the bank to check on that account, he found out that account had been overdrawn. He was confused by this, and so he looked into those charges. It turns out that that bank account was overdrawn because of some insurance premiums. Some insurance premiums had hit that account, and it was greater than the balance. Mr. Flores was confused because this was an insurance premium he knew nothing about. But unbeknownst to Mr. Flores, early morning hours of January 14th, 2009, at about 2:45 a.m., the defendant called 911. And here's where everything takes a big turn. When this 911 call is made, it's just a few short hours after Mr. Flores finds out that Dale's still alive. Within 5 minutes of this 911 call, Gilbert Police Department arrived on scene at the defendant's house. The same house that she shares with the victim, Dale Harrell, and their 3 girls. Now, when police get there, the defendant comes out of the house and she's covered in blood. There's blood on her face, on her front. And they immediately ask the question, are you hurt? Because she is, after all, covered in blood. The defendant told them no, she wasn't hurt. This was her husband's blood on her. She'd been on the phone with 911. There was a cordless home telephone. And police watched as she took that telephone and threw it to the concrete in the driveway. It confused officers because they were already there to help. But at that point, they disregarded it. A short time later, Stan Cook came out of the house and police searched him. They patted him down. And in his right front pocket, they found a small caliber gun. So the police started talking to the defendant. They wanted to know what was going on. And the defendant told them a story similar to one she had told before. She told the police that night she asked Dale for a divorce. When she asked Dale for the divorce, he became enraged. He drew her to the bed, he held her down, and he raped her. She told police that she began screaming and yelling, and that Stan, who was in the room just down the hall, heard the noise. Stan grabbed a gun and came charging into that master bedroom. You'll later see a diagram of the master bedroom, and it's more of a master suite. What the defendant tells police is that as Stan Cook came through those doors, there was a hammer on a table right by the entrance of that room. She said that Stan grabbed that hammer, came over, and began striking Dale in the head with that hammer. She said at that point, she was able to push Dale off of her, and that's how she had the blood on her. That was her explanation to police. So police went into that house. They wanted to see what was going on. When they got in there, they found that the defendant's 3 children, the 3 girls, they were all in their rooms. So police finally made their way to that master bedroom. And when they got in there, they found Dale. Now at this point, when they got into that room, they found Dale lying next to the bed, between the dresser and the bed. He was covered in blood. He was bleeding profusely from the right side of his head. He was moaning, words they couldn't really make out, and appeared he was trying to move. The police calmed Dale down. They encouraged him not to move because of the severity of his injuries. One of the first officers on scene grabbed the camera and started taking pictures as soon as he walked in that room, before even paramedics arrived. And you'll get to see those throughout this trial. The officers grabbed a rag, or a t-shirt, whatever they could find, and they put it on the right side of Dale's head and started applying some light pressure to that wound. As I said, paramedics arrived shortly thereafter. They quickly assessed the situation, and they took Dale to the hospital because this was a very severe injury. They also transported the defendant to the hospital because of her claim of being attacked. They wanted her to be examined as well. So while Dale was at the hospital and the defendant was at another hospital, the police began their investigation. They began their investigation of the scene, and as you're going to hear throughout this trial, the investigation of just the scene took over 24 hours. The police focused their efforts on the master bedroom. But when they got in that master bedroom, they noticed something. Something wasn't right. Like so many other things in this case, something in that master bedroom wasn't right. You see, the police were thinking, based on what they saw, the scene didn't match the story the defendant had given. It was the blood spatter that threw them off. The story the blood spatter was telling was very different than that the one the defendant told. And so Gilbert Police Department called in a man who specializes in blood spatter and teaches classes on blood spatter. His name is Stephen McGibbons. Now throughout this trial, you're going to hear from Stephen McGibbons at length. He's going to talk to you about when he first got on scene and how he processed this scene. Mr. McGibbons looked at a wide variety of factors in the blood spatter. The spatter itself and the directionality of that spatter. And what Mr. McGibbons is going to tell you is that based on what he saw in his opinion is that the assailant, whoever that might be, was standing on the side of the bed next to Dale. He'll also tell you, based on the blood-soaked pillow and the impression left in that pillow, that it's his opinion that Dale was laying down at the time of the attack. He'll tell you that it's his opinion that Dale's left cheek was pressed against the pillow, with all the injuries being to the right side of his head. But Mr. McGibbons' examination didn't stop there. He didn't want to just look at the scene. He also wanted to look at the clothes of the defendant and those of Stan Cook, the clothes that they were wearing at the time of this assault. When Mr. McGibbons looked at the defendant's shirt, he noticed something interesting. He saw that there was a pattern of blood on her shoulder and on her back. According to Mr. McGibbons, it's his opinion that this is the type of pattern that would be made should blood be coming off a swinging hammer and coming to rest. When Mr. McGibbons noticed that, he immediately thought the defendant couldn't have been on her back as she claimed during this assault, because in fact there was blood on her back, which wouldn't have been able to be there. He also noticed the directionality of the blood spatter. And based on what he saw, it was his opinion that it was the defendant who was swinging the hammer that night. Based on all of this, the blood spatter in the room, the blood on the shirt, it's Mr. McGibbons' opinion that the story the defendant gave was not only implausible, but impossible. And so police began to look at things a little differently. They turned their attention to Stanley Cook. Now this is the roommate, the one the defendant claimed to be the assailant. They wanted to find out the history between the two. Well, it turns out that the defendant, Stanley Cook, met at DeVry University somewhere around 2003. Now, prior to their meeting, prior to them becoming friends, Stanley had been in the military. And in 1998, he was riding a motorcycle. He was involved in an accident with a vehicle. From that accident, he sustained some brain injury and an injury to his wrist. As a result of that, he was ultimately discharged from the military. He later attended DeVry, and that's where he met the defendant. Now, throughout their meeting, they developed a friendship while they were at DeVry. And before long, they became friends. The defendant offered to allow Stanley to come live in her home with her and her family. And so Stanley did. He lived with his family for a few years, rent-free. Now, he'd help the defendant with things around the house, chores, things of that nature, and he'd also help her with her kids, with the 3 girls. But because Stanley had sustained this brain injury, he needed some help. He needed some help remembering, we'll call them day-to-day type things. The defendant was more than willing to help him do that. In fact, she was even willing to help him recreate some memories from time to time when he had issues. But on the night of this incident, the defendant was also very willing. She was very willing to put the blame on Stan. It begs the question, why? Well, blaming Stan meant a few things for her. The first is the most obvious. If she blamed Stan, then Stan was on the hook for hurting Dale, not her. But there's something else. Those insurance policies. If she blamed Stan, she would collect the money from the insurance policies. Those insurance policies that she had suddenly become so diligent about making sure that they were paid on time. And as it turns out, a new insurance policy that was worth $1 million that was taken out on Dale. Now, this policy had just become effective January 1st of 2009. And that's the same policy that I told you about that caused the joint account with Ellen Flores to be overdrawn, the one he didn't know about. So, not only would Stan be on the hook for the death of Dale, the defendant stood to get some money from insurance policies, too, in fact. So throughout the first several interviews that the defendant had with the police, this is the story she gave. She told the story over and over again. She told the story that she was being attacked, and Stan was her savior. She told the story again and again until police confronted her. Detective Cy Ray of the Gilbert Police Department came in and told the defendant that her story wasn't true. He told her that they knew that she was the one with the hammer that day. He told her that the blood spatter showed something very different than she was saying. This is obviously something that hadn't been thought out by the defendant. And so her shift changed. Her story changed. A complete 180. She went from talking about Stan being the one to do this, being the one who did this, to a self-preservation mode. She told the police a completely different story at that point. She told them about her relationship with Dale. She told them that Dale was abusive. In fact, she told police three names of people that had witnessed abuse over the years. She told police that it was because of this abuse that she ended up taking a hammer to Dale. So police continued their investigation. They wanted to talk to these people, these three names that the defendant had given them. And off they went to talk to these people. The first person that they talked to was Stan. Now what they learned is that Stan had never witnessed Dale be physically abusive to the defendant. They also talked to two other people, a lady by the name of Kelly Kirshen and her husband, Jeffrey Kirshen. Now the defendant had given very specific events that these people had witnessed. So the police went and asked Mr. and Mrs. Kirshen about these events. And neither of them said they had ever seen anything physical or seen Dale physically assaulting the defendant. In fact, they were asked about these very specific events, and neither of them could recall them. Neither of them could substantiate what the defendant claimed. And so the investigation continued, because these people said they had not seen this physical abuse that the defendant claimed. Throughout the investigation, police became aware of Ellen Flores. However, they didn't know all of the information Mr. Flores had. At this point, they didn't know that the defendant owed him almost $300,000. They didn't know that he was aware of these statements that the defendant had made about wanting to kill Dale, and they didn't know anything about these insurance policies at that point. But like I said, the night of the attack, Dale suffered some very severe injuries, very severe, and he was rushed off to the hospital and immediately went into surgery. And Dale was put in the ICU, and there he stayed for quite some time, weeks in fact. Now during those same weeks that Dale was in ICU, the defendant had some conversations with Mr. Flores. The two had kept in common, despite the defendant's lies coming to light. So one day, he and the defendant had a conversation about insurance policies, the kind of ins and outs, we'll call them. At that point, Mr. Flores told her, you know, a brand new insurance policy, let's say one taken out January 1st of 2009, isn't likely to pay because it's brand new. The defendant was surprised. She didn't know that that was the case. A few days later, another conversation took place about insurance. And during that conversation, Mr. Flores told her that if she had been culpable in any way, shape, or form for causing the injuries, that she would not get any money. He also told her, because Dale was still alive at this point, should an insurance policy pay out, it would go to the policy holder. And the reason it goes to the policy holder is because it's supposed to cover future medical care. The defendant wasn't aware of that. She thought it would go to the beneficiaries, but Mr. Flores was clear that at that point, when somebody's still alive, that money doesn't go to the beneficiaries. So that was January 7th, 2009. The defendant brings that insurance policy over to Mr. Flores so that he could review it, so that he could actually take a look at it and see what exactly it said. That same day, it came to light that Dale's condition was declining. In fact, his condition was declining so significantly that the doctors gave him just a few days to live. That same day, the defendant did something else. She changed the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. She faxed them a letter changing the beneficiary to Mr. Flores as a representative of her children. Now, the next day, there was another conversation about these insurance policies. These insurance policies had become the topic of conversation. Now, during the conversation on the 8th, again, it was discussed when the insurance would pay out and when it wouldn't. At this point, Mr. Flores made it extremely clear. If the defendant was in any way, shape, or form culpable for causing the injury to Dale, she wouldn't get the money. He explained that because the defendant had kept telling him that it was Stan who inflicted this injury, Mr. Flores told the defendant that if in fact it was Stan who caused this injury, there was a possibility. The insurance might pay, but it wasn't clear. So on January 9th, Stan wrote a confession letter. It was a draft. He took that confession letter over to the house of Mr. Flores. And Mr. Flores reviewed that letter. Now at this point, Mr. Flores was still being told by the defendant that Stan is the one who hit Dale with the hammer. And so they reviewed this confession letter. Now that night, at about 7:30 in the evening, Dale passed away. Some time passed, and finally on February 20th, 2009, Stan shows up at the Tempe Police Department. He shows up with his confession letter in hand, wanting to turn himself in. Tempe wasn't in charge of this case. This wasn't their case, and so they sent him over to the Gilbert Police Department. When Stan got to the Gilbert Police Department, he handed them this confession letter. At that point, it was also learned that this confession letter had been edited on one of the computers at Alan Flores' house. And so police were concerned by this confession letter, because they already knew. They had the blood evidence that contradicted Stan's statement in this confession letter. And so they drafted a search warrant. They drafted a search warrant for Mr. Flores' residence. And they went out to Mr. Flores' residence and executed that search warrant. Now, during that search warrant, police found a lot of things at Mr. Flores' home. They found some of the defendant's family photos. They found her passport, her birth certificate. They found the birth certificate of Dale and his social security number. They also found some other stuff. They found insurance documents and folders. But one of the most important things that Gilbert police found on that day was those promissory notes, especially the last one, where the defendant owed $294,000 plus interest. It was at this point that this information that Mr. Flores had came to the attention of the Gilbert Police Department. They now knew about the money owed and the stories the defendant had told Mr. Flores about wanting to kill her husband. they took the next step. They wanted to go talk to Travis Tatro. Police wanted to find out, did Mr. Tatro even exist? And had this conversation ever taken place? So off they went to see Mr. Tatro. Now, Mr. Tatro is an interesting guy, a very intimidating type of guy. When police met him, they found out that Mr. Tatro and the defendant had met years prior to the defendant's death. They found out that the defendant and Mr. Tatro had worked together at a club, and Mr. Tatro was actually a bouncer there. But Mr. Tatro didn't know the defendant as Marissa. He knew her by her nickname, Reese. According to Mr. Tatro, there hadn't been continual contact between him and the defendant. But early one morning, in early January of 2009, the defendant showed up at his mother's house. To him, showed up out of the blue. And when he spoke to the defendant asked him to take care of her husband. Now, this surprised Mr. Tatro. The reason it surprised Mr. Tatro is because he was under the belief that Dale had already died, that he had died years prior. Because the defendant had told him a story that she had been poisoning Dale, and that as a result, Dale ended up dying from stomach cancer. So Mr. Tatro was confused, because to him, he was being asked to kill a person that was already dead. So Mr. Tatro decided not to get involved. He decided to send the defendant on her way and never agreed to perform this hit for her. But with all of this information, it became very clear. It became very clear to police that the defendant had been planning to kill Dale. I want to caution you about a few things as we go through this trial, ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of dates, a lot more that you're going to find out about, more than what I've just listed here. And because of that, I ask you to take some good, careful notes. There's also a lot of evidence impounded in this case. And the Gilbert Police Department gives them an item number, and you'll be given those as we go through. I ask you to pay attention to those and where they were found so that you can link them up later on what was found where. Because what we learned throughout this case, the defendant likes money and she likes easy money. In fact, she borrowed over $300,000 from a man without any way of paying it back, without any real way of paying it back. The promissory notes at the end of January, it was coming due. She had already escaped it once when it wasn't paid on January 31st of 2008. She got that extension to December 31st of 2008. She got the extension to January 31st of 2009. But that note was coming due. That note was coming due, and the fact that there was no insurance settlement or trust was really coming to light at this point. So she needed a way to get some easy money, and she needed it quick. She took out an insurance policy, and she made sure that the premiums on that first insurance policy were paid timely. So once the defendant thought that all that money was in place, she set her plan in action. She set her plan in action to kill Dale Harrell because she thought she would come into millions of dollars from these insurance policies, and this would be her way out. The night she killed Dale Harrell was planned. She had planned it out for a long time. It wasn't Stan, it was her. And because of that, the defendant has been charged with first-degree murder, also known as premeditated murder. And at the close of all the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, you will be firmly convinced that the defendant had been planning this, and she planned to kill Dale the night of January 14th, 2009, just before that 911 call was made. And at the close of all the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be asking you to return a guilty verdict as to first-degree murder. Thank you.
Counsel for defense.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alan Tavasoli, and you have met my team. And I also want to point out, sitting at the council table is Mrs. Suzanne DuBois Harrell. She is the defendant in this case. Now, I want to start my opening statement by pointing out a few of the jury instructions that the judge read to you already yesterday when we finalized the jury. Okay? One of those is the duty of jurors section. And it basically says, please keep an open mind. That's kind of the gist of it. We selected each and every one of you because we thought you all could keep an open mind. Okay? And that's why both sides kind of came to an agreement that you were the people that we wanted for our jury. And so I just want you to make sure that you're going to be able to listen to all the evidence here and not make prejudgments about what you've heard now and what you're about to hear when we start taking testimony. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the lawyer's statements are not evidence. So each side basically has a theory of their case, and we present it to you. Okay? And then you kind of fit in, you hear what the evidence is, and you figure out what the facts are. And you decide what the law is. And the bottom line is you come to a decision about what you think should happen in this case. Because the lawyer's statements are not evidence, and that is in your jury instructions as well, page 4. I'm here to tell you that what Ms. Areno just said, all of that stuff she said, not evidence. All the stuff I'm going to say, not evidence. Okay? So what we're talking about is what we think what our theories of the case are here. Okay? And then you're going to hear the evidence, and you're going to have to figure out which stories kind of match and which don't, and which ones are kind of outlandish and which ones aren't. And that's your job, is basically as a jury decide what those facts are and apply those to the law and come to a decision. Now, you've heard the state's theory of the case and what they expect the evidence will show. And Ms. Areno went on and on. She